and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'd like to talk about the Serbian Army from 1875 to 1878. This period will cover the First and Second Serbo-Turkish Wars. In 1875, there was a popular uprising in Herzegovina, and that prompted the Ottoman army to send in a lot of troops. The uprising in Herzegovina triggered a lot of sentiment, a lot of anti-Ottoman sentiment that had already been there for a long time, but it reinvigorated it. And in June of 1876, the Serbian army began to mobilize. On July 2nd of 1876, military operations began. Now, the composition of this army consisted really of two armies. The Serbian army was the standing army, the professional army, and the People's Army, which was a militia made up of three separate levies. The standing army consisted of 5,000 men, organized into 2 infantry battalions, 2 cavalry squadrons, 2 engineer battalions, 8 field, and 4 mountain batteries. Serbia opened its first military academy in 1850, and by the time of the 1876 war, they had 360 serving officers who had graduated that academy. Those officers were further supplemented by officers on leave from the Austro-Hungarian army and the Russian army, and the Russian and Austrian officers served primarily in the staff and the headquarters units. Foreign military observers commented on the high professionalism of the Serbian officers, that they were well educated both in military and civil matters, that the officers usually spoke more than one language, which is a necessity in the Balkans, and that they were well regarded among both the military and the general population. The primary infantry arm of the Serbian Standing Army was the Lorenz Peabody, model of 1871. It was a breech-loading conversion of the Lorenz rifle, and the Serbians had acquired a lot of these rifles in the late 1860s. The Lorenz Peabody was perhaps not quite as modern as the Ottoman Army's Peabody Martini rifle, but it was still adequate, and it was certainly comparable to the Snyder Enfield and Snyder Springfield conversions that were also in use by the Ottoman Army. The Serbian artillery was composed primarily of guns of the French Lahit system. At the time of the war in 1876, they had about 160 pieces of various calibers of this system. It was obsolete, but they had pretty much had everything part of the same system. And so in that sense, it was very uniform, if obsolete. The arms of the cavalry were much less standardized. They were consisted of a mix of muzzle-loading carbines, Gasser revolvers, Francot revolvers, and some Smith & Wesson Russian models. The sabers consisted of Russian Model 1817 and 1827 light cavalry sabers, Model 1838 Cossack shashkas, and Model 1841 Dragoon shashkas. Serbian gunners, regardless of if they were in the Standing Army or the People's Army, did receive their training, artillery training, with the Standing Army, and so they had a very high confidence. In contrast to the Standing Army, the People's Army was a militia. It was organized into 3 levies, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. These levies were organized into military districts. Each military district was required to furnish 2 brigades of the 1st levy, 2 brigades of the 2nd levy, and 1 battalion of the 3rd levy. Now, these troops made up the bulk of the army. They had 36 brigades and 18 battalions, and a number of other smaller units. Unfortunately, though, their training was lackluster, it was very poor, the discipline was very poor, and they were poorly equipped. Now, men from the 1st levy did receive a uniform very comparable to that of the Standing Army, and you'll see it right here. The men in the 2nd levy received only a cap and overcoat, and the men in the 3rd levy fought in their own clothes. The arms were, for the 1st levy, the same Lorenz Peabody rifles, model of 1871. The soldiers of the 2nd levy were armed with green conversions, and the green conversion was a breech-loading conversion of a rifle musket, and it fired 2-part ammunition. It used a paper cartridge that was ignited with a percussion cap. And one of the problems with the green was, since the percussion cap channel does not have a direct path to the paper cartridge, it would often have ignition problems with the paper not burning through completely, sometimes requiring 2 or 3 caps to set off. Fundamentally, that conversion was very unreliable, and the rate of fire wasn't really increased. It was nominally 4 to 6 rounds a minute, but under real field conditions, it was around 2 to 3, no different than the rifle musket had been. Surviving examples are not easy to come by, and the details are not very clear to me. I believe that some of the green conversions were done on Lorenz rifle muskets, while other ones were perhaps done on Belgian copies of the Enfield rifle musket. And these were acquired in the late 1860s. The conversions were carried out in Serbia. The 3rd Levy militia were armed with percussion, muzzle-loading arms of two types: the French Vincennes rifle musket, shown here, and the Russian Model 1845 musket. By the summer of 1876, muzzle-loading percussion arms were very obsolete, but they were at least reliable, which is more than can be said for the green. At the outset of the war, the Serbian Army had 38,000 Peabodys, 17,000 greens, and 70,000 muzzle-loading rifle muskets. At the end of the First War, they had only 35,000 Peabodys, 12,000 greens, and 65,000 rifle muskets. And of those weapons, only around 71% were functional. And that meant they had to send guys home. They had to discharge some troops for lack of weapons. In the late 1860s, uniforms would be standardized across both forces. The basic uniform consisted of a dark blue cap, a gray-blue overcoat, dark blue trousers, and a brown tunic. For the artillery and the cavalry, they wore black boots. For the infantry of both the Standing Army and the People's Army, they wore opanki, which is a traditional type of Serbian footwear. It's kind of like a shoe with a legging incorporated. The soldiers of the Standing Army had a tunic with a standing collar, and the soldiers of the People's Army had a falling collar, and that's the big visual difference. The soldiers in the first band have roughly the same field uniforms as the Standing Army with the falling collar tunic. The soldiers of the second levy have only a cap and overcoat, and the soldiers of the third levy will fight in their own clothing. All soldiers will have arms and accoutrements, however. A third and temporary component of the army would have been the volunteers. These volunteers were Austrians, Russians, Bulgarians, Montenegrins, Serbs from outside of Serbia, Italians, and other Slavic peoples. According to the drawings that I've seen, the period sketches, they are uniformed much in the same way as the Standing Army or the First Levy volunteers. Though the Italian volunteers, the Garibaldi volunteers, will wear the red scarf as they often wear in every war they volunteer in. The Montenegrin volunteers will often wear their traditional ethnic costume. And the officers and the volunteers are very well uniformed, much like you'd see any regular Serbian officer. The overall character of the army was very highly motivated and very high on enthusiasm. They were incredibly brave. But the bulk of the army was not professional. They were not well trained. They were not well disciplined. The volunteers did tend to be pretty good. The Standing Army was very good. But their arms were also not very good. The bulk of their arms were muzzle-loading arms, muzzle-loading rifle muskets and muzzle-loading cannon. And so while they had a great standardization, at least with the cannon and with a lot of the arms, they just weren't really up to snuff. They weren't that new. When reading about the battles of the First Serbo-Turkish War, you're going to see a lot of defeats on the Serbian side, a lot of counterattacks. The soldiers are brave and they continue to come back again and again and again, 3-4 times in a battle to counterattack, but they are beaten and they don't really win a lot of those battles, and so they will sign an armistice with the Ottoman Empire. On April 24th, 1877, the Russo-Turkish War begins. The Serbians are not immediately able to join in on the Russian side due to some of the issues they'd had in trying to rebuild following the First War, but they will enter the war. Military operations begin December 15th, 1877, and the Serbian army is able to liberate Pirot, Nils, and Kosovo. They're able to wrap it up by the end of January. In the end of January, the Ottomans and the Russian Empire sign a peace treaty, and the Serbs will sign one, begin their negotiations in February. By March, everything is wrapped up and Serbia is an independent nation. Now, so far as using the Serbs in the game of the men who would be kings, I would rate the Standing Army infantry as regular infantry. I wouldn't give many modifiers, but one way or the other. For the People's Army infantry, for the first levy, I would make them unwilling and poor shots. And this is to reflect the fact that they weren't highly disciplined and they weren't well trained. I often use unwilling for soldiers that are just not well trained. Not necessarily that they didn't want to fight, they were just very hard to command because they had no discipline and formal training and they didn't really drill often. For the second band infantry, I would make them unwilling, poor shots, and I'd give them obsolete arms. And for the third band, I probably would probably just rate those men as irregulars that are unwilling and poorly armed, but perhaps not poorly armed because they already have rifle muskets. I would rate the green and any of the muzzle-loading arms the same. And so even though the green's a breech loader, it wasn't a very good breech loader. It was very unreliable. For the cavalry, it's kind of hard to say. They did have muzzle-loading guns, though, there are a lot of other muzzle-loading guns that are just fine. The artillery crews themselves were all trained in the standing army, and they were highly competent. For the volunteers, I would probably rate them as regular infantry, and I might make them poorly armed. I don't have enough visual, like photograph evidence of how they were armed. They may have been armed with rifle muskets or greens. I'm not sure, but they all wanted to be there, and so they were very highly motivated to fight. For the cavalry, I would probably just make them regular cavalry, and I'd make them poorly armed because they did have a hodgepodge of revolvers, and the carbines they had were older muzzle-loading carbines. I can't really think of much else to say about the Serbian army at this time. It was an army that had high motivation. They wanted independence, but it was an army that was very large and made up mostly of militia, and so that's always a problem when you only have 5,000 regular soldiers. For instance, in the first Serbo-Turkish War, they had 124,000 soldiers, and only 5,000 of those soldiers were professional. They were facing 133,000 Ottoman soldiers, and even their Ottoman reservists were pretty good. In addition to that, there were 20,000 Bashi bazooks they had to go against. And so, they do really poorly in the first Serbo-Turkish War, and it's easy to understand why. The fact that they were able to fight as well as they did is kind of amazing. The uniforms I like, they're very simple and they're very practical. The same basic uniform will be in use up to the First World War, which is kind of interesting. The colors will change, but the cut doesn't really change that much. Now, as far as miniatures, there aren't really a lot of options that I would know off the top of my head. The only ones that I can think of are made by Outpost Miniatures, and they're sold through Badger Games in the United States. There aren't really a lot of poses, and so you're pretty much limited to infantry. And the infantry models that are sculpted are all infantry of the standing army. And since they have full uniforms, I would say they're first levy, and so they'd be armed with Peabodies, but some actually would have greens in real life because there weren't enough Peabodies for all those units. There are also some Montenegrin volunteers, but you could easily paint those men as third band troops or second band troops since they didn't really have full uniforms anyway. And that at least with the military, the caps are based off traditional Serbian type caps, as are the opunki shoes. And so with those miniatures, you can get a good broad range of volunteers and at least the People's Army infantry. And if you wanted to use them as standing army infantry, I don't know that most other people are going to know the difference, nor will they probably say anything to you about it. As far as artillery, you're kind of hard up in cavalry. There are a lot of sketches of the period that really show good sketches of the infantry. I don't really see much of the artillery and not much of the cavalry. And so if you could find something suitable in some of the other ranges, you may be able to use some of the Montenegrin miniatures from the Outpost Miniatures line, and that might work. And I guess to say in closing, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I plan on doing one for the Romanians in the future and one for the Russian army, for the Russo-Turkish War. I don't know when I'm going to get around to those. The Russian one should come around quicker since I've read a book about them in the Russo-Turkish War. I just got a book on the Romanians. I haven't even cracked it yet, so I don't know when that's going to happen. But if you like this video, if you're enjoying this series, please leave a comment and tell me what you think I could improve. I'm always looking for ways to get better at this. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.